Hello, my name is Tim Whitmarsh, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Sutton Trust Summer School, excellently organised as ever. This year, we're on the theme of race, and I'm going to be talking to you about skin colour in classical antiquity. I'll do my very best with the technology, but if I have any problems, do bear with me. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I want to use for this presentation. Here we go, and I will start that now. Okay, skin color in ancient Greece. We tend to think of skin color as something that is universal, that is something that is sort of built into, if you like, the order of humanity, that people have different skin colors. We're very visual people, by and large, we humans. We tend to see faces, we recognize them, we associate them with various things, we have strong reactions to the way that people look. But all of this, whilst it does come from nature, I mean, we use our eyes all the time, it is also heavily socialized. There's no universal idea of skin color. There's no universal idea of race as we tend to understand it today. Every single culture thinks about these issues in a different kind of way. And that's really what I want to talk to you today about. I want to talk to you about the idea that the ancient Greek world configured skin color in ways that are almost unimaginably different to ours. And I think this really matters, and it matters for reasons that I will make very clear. These have to do with modern racism, essentially. There are many people in the modern world, unfortunately, who believe that white skin colors give people privilege, that mean that they believe that being possessor of a certain kind of pigmentation somehow makes you superior to other people. Sometimes this is expressed in the form of very strong visceral racism, and sometimes it's simply assumed. Sometimes it's not stated, it's just the natural assumptions that people have about the way that the world works. All of this needs to be contested. And in particular, I think it needs to be contested that this idea of what we call white supremacism, the idea that white people are better than other kinds of people in the world, has some kind of links back to ancient Greece. Because this, again, is a very common idea, and it's a common idea both in the formally expressed tense. People do say, particularly on the far right, do tend to claim heritage back to classical Greece. They do tend to say that European civilizations are superior because of a classical ancestry. But it's also more common in a more indefinable way in Western culture. There is a tacit assumption often that being Western somehow equates to having some sort of genetic link back to ancient Greece. So a lot of what we do when we think about color, skin color in the ancient world, is try to stop that. We try to say, look, firstly, there is no direct biological or cultural link between modernity and antiquity. There are, of course, all sorts of ways in which Greek ideas and Roman ideas were terribly influential and have been influential and have shaped aspects of not just European, but Islamic and other forms of thought. That's a given, okay, we can accept that. But what we don't want is this idea of a natural, unproblematic link connecting certain classes of people in the modern world, particularly white people, genetically to classical antiquity, or indeed culturally. A lot of, I started off talking about the visual nature of humanity, the fact that we tend to attach very strong emotional signals to, or emotional responses to visual signals. A lot of this assumption that the Greeks were white comes from images. It comes from the very widespread perception in modern society that Greeks look like Greek marble statues, and I'm sure other people will be talking to you during the course of this summer school about that. So there is a lot of encouragement around, I think, in our society to think of Greeks as white and somehow as part of a continuum with modern ideas of whiteness. So as I say, what I'm trying to do in this talk is participate in the wider project of trying to interrupt that narrative and try to tell you that the Greeks certainly did not think of themselves as white. Now, the recent example of this phenomenon came in 2018. I say recent, of course, I'm a classicist, so anything that's under 2,000 years old is recent for my standards. It's actually almost 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. Troy, Fall of a City, BBC Netflix production, wasn't widely rated by the critics. I actually quite liked it myself. But it aired and it had quite a lot of controversy because it cast black actors in the roles not only of Greeks, but also of Greek gods. Now, at one level, you'd have thought it's crazy for people to protest against the depiction of fictional characters and fictional gods. I mean, sorry, that might sound disrespectful to those that believe in ancient Greek religions, but there aren't many of them around these days. This is a fictional story. So why people get particularly upset by the depiction of black skin color in connection with these these stories beats me. I would also say that, I mean, whilst it is true that black Africans were unlikely to have been common in any large numbers in the Greco-Roman, sorry, certainly in the Greek world, the early Greek world, although they would have become more visible later on, very few ancient Greeks would have looked like the supposed, the white characters in Troy either. The whole thing is anachronistic. The whole thing is fantasy. Well, all of the actors and actresses look nothing like ancient Greeks would have looked like. For a start, they're a lot taller. Okay, so we know for a fact from surviving ancient Greek skeletons that the Greeks were quite tiny. The idea that black skin color was the only anachronism in this is crazy. Now, there's David Gyazi, who was Achilles in it. There is Brad Pitt, who was Achilles in the Hollywood epic Troy. Nobody protested about historical inaccuracy when Brad Pitt was cast as Achilles in the historical Troy. Absolutely no one protested about that. Why? Because there is this natural assumption that the ancient Greeks looked like modern Europeans. They didn't. Here's a bit of the backlash that hit the BBC in the aftermath of this. I got swept up in this when I did an interview with the Radio Times. You can see the screenshot there from on the right, or at least my right, about that. And you can see, if you want to, you can see some of the sort of the more pleasant end of the actually extremely nasty Twitter reaction to this. It really brings out racism in people if you cast black actors in Greek roles. Now, ironically, if you look to some of the earliest depictions of Greeks, Greek males, you can see that they are depicted as black. These are what we call black figure vases. They're produced by a particular technique of firing the clay in certain ways, and that means that the sort of red terracotta color that you can see and the black color that you can see there on the vase are produced simply by applying different layers of slip on the surface of the clay, which produces a different skin color effect. So the Greeks did distinguish between black and white visually, as you can see on this vase. But interestingly, this is not an ethnic distinction. This is nothing whatsoever to do with what we call race. Now, the characters that we have here, perhaps I can use my cursor to indicate them. There is Helen being taken off, the mythical character Helen being taken off with two Greek men around her, and you can see their skin color there showing through underneath their armor. Helen is white. Over here you have a different scene the judgment of the goddesses. Three goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. And you can see again that they are depicted with white skin color there. So the lesson that you learn from reading this image is that the Greeks too were very visual people, that they thought very hard in terms of the stimuli that come at them. They thought about the images that they wanted to circulate in their society. They wanted to give people clues as to differentiations between one group of people and another group of people. But it's nothing to do, as I say, with race or ethnicity. It's got everything to do with gender. White skin color is a way of depicting femaleness, and in particular aristocratic femaleness. Black skin color here is a way of depicting masculinity on this kind of vase. So there is already a bit of a response to the racists, if you like. On the one hand, the Greeks didn't, they were perfectly happy to depict Greek men as with black skin color. And on the other hand, they had a completely different way of understanding the differentiation between black and white skin color. Nothing to do with race, everything to do with gender. And that's actually quite instructive. The Greeks were obsessed with gender. They really did think of it as a fundamental organizing principle in the world. You can see this differentiation by skin color in terms of gender in literature too. Here are two extracts from plays from the classical period, the period of classical Athens, 5th and 4th centuries BCE. We all know, or many of you will know, about tragedy and comedy being these great theatrical forms that the Athenians invented. And in fact, obviously we owe a lot of our modern conception of the theatre to the Greeks and the Romans. In the first play, a tyrants are always bad in this kind of literature. It's a tragedy, this, by the way. It's Euripides' Bacchae, the play about Dionysus and his followers. In the first play, this tyrant accuses the god Dionysus, who is in disguise, he doesn't realize that he's a god, of being white by contrivance. And the claim is that Dionysus is effeminate and that he deliberately keeps his skin color light and pale to look more feminine, and therefore to look more attractive, to look more boyish, to look more alluring to women. And that's a lot of the dynamic of this play, is about how the tyrant Pentheus is attacking the god Dionysus for associating with women too much. The second is a comedy, and it's one of a number of comedies of reversal of sex that Aristophanes, the comic poet, comes up with. In these plays, what tends to happen is that the women take over. It's a male-dominated society. The women take over temporarily, and they usually end up going back to their homes and back to submission at the end of the play. So not very progressively minded, if you like, but that's another discussion. What I really want to talk about here is the fact that in one of these, early on, one of the women who's been told that she has to impersonate a man stands, she basically reconfigures her body to make it look more manly. And you can see that, first of all, she says, I've got armpits bushier than underbrush, so she hasn't been shaving her armpits, again, turning her into a male, just as we agreed. Then whenever my husband went up to the agora, to the marketplace, I oiled myself and stood in the sun all day getting a tan. Okay, now getting a tan is a translation, obviously. There is an ancient commentator on this who says that she's turning herself black at this point. So the language of blackness is very heavily associated with masculinity, and the language of whiteness is associated with femininity. That is part of the story, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because if you ask yourself the question, what did Greek men, and remember all of our texts are pretty much written by men, all of our visual material is pretty much composed by men. This is a very male-dominated society and a very male-dominated evidence base. Okay, so what did those men who produced these texts think their skin color was like? The evidence for that is vanishingly thin. We have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I haven't counted them, obviously millions of words probably from ancient Greece. If you take a 1,000-year span of a huge amounts of stuff, there is almost no reference to the skin color of Greek men. So this leads me to believe one further fact, to draw one further conclusion about the ancient Greeks and skin color, and this is that they thought of, Greek men thought of skin color as something that other people had. They didn't think of it as something that they themselves had. Whenever they talk about skin color, they're talking about either abnormal states or they're talking about people who aren't like them. So, of course, Greeks talk about people going pale when they're ill or when they are they've had a shock or something. They do talk about changes of skin color, but those are abnormal states. They're not normal states. Greek men do not have skin color. Here is one exception, which I'm not going to talk about in any great detail, but the famous epic poet Homer, in his Odyssey, does actually refer to Odysseus as having a black skin color. So in these one or two cases where we talk about male skin color, the tendency is to talk about men as having black skin color, but it's very, very rare. A further development to this is that we're talking now, Homer is very early, the earliest of our Greek literary sources. As you get a little bit later on, Greeks do come into contact with black Africans, and they do start marking that. They do start noting it. Here is a vase from the 6th century, about the same date as the earlier vase we saw, so a little bit after Homer, but before the dramatic texts that we looked at, in the in-between area between the two. This is another black figure vase, so the default position of the clay after it's been fired is, for the skin color at least, is black. And you have here a black male with two white companions, Amazons. Now this is clearly depicting a sort of offensively parodic caricature of a black African man. But of course, for the reasons that we talked about earlier, it's not the skin color that is depicting him, that is marking him out as a black African. It is the facial characteristics and the unusual clothing that he wears. Okay, so we have to unlearn our habits of saying, oh look, that's a black man. All men were black in this figure form of vase painting. And the contrast between black and white here, as ever, marks not ethnicity, but gender. You do get contrasts between, they're not very common, but you get these kind of vases that do depict a contrast between blacks and Greeks in terms of skin color, but not just skin color. Note, you can see that in the one on the right, for example, is a better example. The one on the left, well, actually, they're both similar, but you can see that the facial structures are being contrasted as well. You can see the hair is being contrasted. So we do tend to see the skin color. We see that we've trained to think of skin color as a carrier of ethnic difference, but it's not the only carrier of ethnic difference for the Greeks and the Romans. One other point I would like to make here is that the skin color of the Greek characters here is not white. And I come back to this, I can't stress it enough. The Greeks did not think of themselves as white. When they came into contact with black Africans, they did start describing black Africans as black, but they also came into contact with Europeans further north, whom they described as white. And the Greeks didn't like to think of themselves as either. They thought of themselves as occupying a median position between the two. So when you look at this vase, you must not think of it, must not, that's my moral message for you, you mustn't think of it as showing a black figure on one side and a white figure on the other. It doesn't. We have to train our eyes to see differently. What it's showing is a black figure and a terracotta color figure, a sort of ruddy brown color figure. So what have we learned in this lecture? We've learned, I think, that the racist idea that the Greeks thought of them, that Greeks were somehow white, is entirely wrong. The Greeks didn't think of themselves as white. They thought of themselves as occupying a mid position. Once they come into contact with Black Africans and Europeans further north, and they had a bit more cultural awareness, if you like, they thought of themselves as occupying a middle position between Africans and Northern Europeans, not white, but somewhere in between the two. Secondly, when Greeks talk about black and white skin color, almost always they're talking not about race, they're talking about gender. Okay, it's a really important point. And finally, I would say the most important side of all of this really is to think that our categories of black and white that we have received are not universal. They're not in nature. They are the product of a particular historical moment. And that moment is very largely driven by the transatlantic slave trade, which from the 16th century onwards, Europeans were transporting large numbers of Africans across to Brazil and to the West Indies and to North America and treating them as a slave class. This meant that the distinction between black and white was one that was encoded in law, and when people saw black skin color, when they saw white skin color, they were very enculturated to think about these in terms of differences of social status. Black people were shamefully viewed as slaves, and for some people naturally slavish. White people were viewed as masters, and for some people naturally masters. That is not a universal feature throughout history. That is a product of the last few centuries, and it's something that we must learn very rapidly to unlearn if we're going to have any chance of building an optimistic, bright, inclusive future for everyone. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the course, and I'm sorry I can't see you. I much prefer to do the face-to-face interaction side of things with people, but I hope you're all enjoying. I hope life, I hope lockdown hasn't been too hard for all of you, and I hope you whatever you end up doing, wherever you end up studying or working, whatever, I hope you have very successful careers. More power to you. See you soon.